Bibles this morning. Let's turn to Judges chapter 7. I don't know if you remember the cartoon or not. It used to be one of my favorite cartoons. Underdog. I used to love that cartoon. Every Saturday morning, that's where you would be, watching a cartoon on television. Underdog was one of my favorites. I think a lot of us like the story of underdogs. We want the person who has the least chance of winning to win. And that's why a lot of the stories in the Bible hit home so often, because we know that these are people that went up against impossible odds. But in the end, they were victorious. And in every case, because they let God lead them. And Gideon is actually one of the best examples, and probably one of the most known examples of somebody who went up against impossible odds. And we're getting to the point in the story of Gideon today where it's one of my favorite parts of the story. Because it was an unexpected moment that happened by the power of God. And Gideon took what was a ragtag army, and he destroyed the Midianites. So we're going to look together in Judges chapter 7, and we'll begin reading in verse 1. It says, early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Merom. And the Lord said to Gideon, you have too many men for me to deliver Midian into their hands. In order that Israel may not boast against me that her own strength has saved her, announce now to the people, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. But the Lord said to Gideon, there are still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will sift them for you there. If I say this one shall go with you, he shall go. If I say this one shall not go with you, he shall not go. So Gideon took the men down to the water. There the Lord told him, separate those who lap the water with their tongues like a dog from those who kneel down to drink. 300 men lapped with their hands to their mouths. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the other men go, each to his own place. So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites to their tents, but kept the 300 who took over the provisions and trumpets of the others. And now the camp of Midian lay below them in the valley. And during the night the Lord said to Gideon, get up, go down against the camp, because I'm going to give it into your hands. If you're afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah, and listen to what they are saying. And afterward you will be encouraged to attack the camp. So he and Purah, his servant, went down to the outposts of the camp, the Midianites, the Amalekites, all the other eastern peoples that settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand of the seashore. And Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend his dream. I had a dream, he was saying. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midian camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed. His friend responded, this can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands. And when Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he worshipped God. He returned to the camp of Israel and called out, get up! The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands. And dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them with torches inside. Watch me, he told them. Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp, blow yours, and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. And Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they had changed their guard. They blew their trumpets, broke the jars that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars. And grasping the torches in their left hands and holding their right hands, and with their right hands the trumpets they were to blow, they shouted, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. And when the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. The army fled to Beth Shittah towards Sererah, as far as the border of Abel, Meloah, and Tabbath. Israelites from Naphtali, Asher, and all Manasseh were called out, and they pursued the Midianites. Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth-barah. So all the men of Ephraim called out. And they took the waters of the Jordan as far as Bethbara. They also captured 2 of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb and Zeb at the winepress of Zeb. And they pursued the Midianites and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon, who was by the Jordan. Now, you know, when you look at Hebrews, one of the more famous chapters in Hebrews is chapter 11. And what they talk about in Hebrews 11 is faith. You know, the very first verse in Hebrews 11 is one that a lot of us have committed to memory. Faith is the evidence of things hoped for, the substance of things not seen. And then that chapter goes into a list of people that were great examples of faith. And Gideon is one of the people on that list. But when you read the story of Gideon, there's so many times that he was absolutely the opposite of a man of faith. In fact, he tested God 3 different times when God was calling him to lead. But after all of that resisting, when God was calling him, he knew it was God calling him. We've already talked about this. He had no doubt about it being God, but he wanted to test God. After all of that, he finally started to lead, and he put together an army of 32,000 men. Now, we're not told a lot about the army, but if you were to go back a little bit, you learn that they did not call anyone from the tribe of Ephraim. And that's important to remember, because next week we'll pick that back up. But in Judges chapter 8, verse 10, it says that the Midianite army had 135,000 men. So at that point, with 32,000 men, Gideon and his army, the odds against them were 4-1. They were undermanned, and they were undermanned when it came to weapons too. But in spite of those odds, God looked down at the army and he said, it's too big. And probably most of us would have shook our heads at that point, because the odds are already 4-1 against us. But God told Gideon to give those men a chance to go home. He said, just go out there and say, listen, if you're afraid, go home. So that's all he did. He said, listen, anybody afraid, go home. 22,000 people went home. Now that tells you something. The people that came out with all of their bravado, whatever it might have been, to go up against the Midianites, when Gideon gave them the opportunity to go home like God told him to do, the majority of them left. He was left with 10,000 men. And given all the doubts that Gideon had and all the testing that Gideon had done with God, quite frankly, I'm surprised Gideon hung around. But this is actually where you start to see that faith that they're talking about in Hebrews 11. This is one of those examples, the fact that he didn't run. And then God explained to Gideon that after the battle, he wanted to make sure. The reason he was cutting this army down is because he didn't want the Israelites to have any room to brag about the victory. But after those men left, those odds that used to be 4-1 had now gone to over 13-1 against Gideon. And God looked at that army and said, it's still too big. And he gave them another test for the men. He said, take them down to drink water. And he was supposed to see how many men drank the water by cupping their hands as they walked and bringing the water to their mouth, versus some of them that would drop down and just put their face in the water and lap like dogs. And there were only 300 men who cupped their hands to bring the water up to their mouth. And I want you to understand that it wasn't about drinking, how they drank the water that was the issue. And I've actually heard this taught in some cases where people would say, well, God was cutting away the people who really weren't that good to start with. So like the people that were scared, he cut them away. And then the people who weren't aware of their surroundings, they were just falling in water when they could have been attacked, versus people that held their swords or spears and were walking. You know, that was never the point. In fact, if that were the point, he wouldn't have had them separated at all, because the point was never to see how skilled the soldiers were. The point was always that the stage was about to be set in a way that when all the dust settled, God was the only one that could get the glory for it. And there's actually a quick lesson to be learned here. And this is something that you don't hear people talk about a lot. And it sounds kind of harsh, I guess. But the truth of the matter is, when God needs to prepare us to serve Him, He very rarely gives us this pep talk to tell us that we need to believe in ourselves. You don't ever hear that from God. In fact, I don't think you ever. In fact, He does just the opposite. Sometimes He reminds you just how weak you are, so that you know you have to depend on Him completely. This is why I've always hated that expression, God helps those who help themselves. I don't like that. If you can help yourself, why do you need God? The people that humble themselves around God. The goal is not to build up our self-confidence. The goal is to build up our faith. And that's actually what was happening with Gideon. That's why so often God will use humble people who feel like they're nobodies, either in their eyes or maybe in the eyes of other people. And He takes people like that and He uses them to do extraordinary things. He wants people who in the end are going to point to Him and give Him all the glory for everything that happened. And I think we need to understand that, because some of today's most popular Christian authors are selling books by telling people, you're great. And you just need to be the great person that God has made you to be. But God doesn't promote self-esteem, not even human potential. What God promotes are people who are willing to be available and willing to be faithful. So Gideon was left with 300 men. And if you're keeping score, those odds that started out at 4 to 1, that jumped to over 13 to 1, are now against Gideon 450. But this is where you start to see Gideon at his best. There was no pushback, and this is important to note. This is one of the reasons why I think Gideon made this the chapter in Hebrews 11. There was no pushback. He didn't talk about, well, now, God, there's no way we can win this battle. We might have had a chance with 32,000, but now we have absolutely zero chance. You don't hear any pushback at all. Because I think at that point, Gideon had been convinced that what he was doing was exactly what God wanted him to do. And I can tell you this from personal experience, and you can tell me from personal experience. When you're in the middle of doing something that you know without any question is what God wants you to do, it's one of the greatest feelings in the world. It is an empowering thing. Not because you have the strength to do it or the ability to do it, but because you know that God is going to use you in a way that you realize you couldn't do on your own. And at this point in the story, Gideon has gotten to the place where he understood that. He understood that all of these things were happening because God was strengthening him and going to use him, and he was on board with it. But deep down inside, I know that God knew that Gideon was still concerned. And I know that because God sent Gideon and his servant down to the Midianite camp to see what was going on down there, to spy on. And even as a kid, I always loved to hear this story because it talked about an army as big as locusts. I mean, it was like a herd of locusts. And their camels, you couldn't even count them. They had so many of them. And what it's doing is just setting the stage, just saying Gideon is literally going up against something that's impossible. There's no way. There's no way he can win this on his own. And not only did they have more men than Gideon had, they were far better equipped than Gideon was. And it's hard to imagine when he was sneaking down in this camp, the things that must have been going through his mind. I don't even know. I would have been scared out of my mind. But we know that he was being led by God. And it's interesting that God led him right down to a place where he was able to eavesdrop on a tent of someone sharing a dream. And God led Gideon to the exact right spot at the exact right second to hear a dream interpreted that Gideon and his army were going to beat the Midianites. It sounds sort of like a strange dream, a round bread rolling into a tent. But the person that heard it immediately was able to say, you know what that means? It means that Gideon is going to defeat the Midianite army. And it just so happened that Gideon heard him say that. And that's all that Gideon needed. If he lacked any confidence at all, at that point, he was 100% on board with the plan. Now, before we get to the battle itself, this is a point where we stop and realize just how kind and gracious God is with us. He understood the fear that Gideon had. He understood the fear that those 300 men must have had facing 135,000 people. But God wanted to encourage them. And I think that's what we see in our own lives. God bends down to our weaknesses. He's not there to rebuke us in those times. He's there to reassure us. And it's okay to admit to the Lord that you're afraid, that you have doubts. You have to come to the Lord in all honesty. He already knows what you're going through. You're not going to tell him something that he doesn't already know. And that reassurance that God gave to Gideon was what Gideon needed to move forward without any hesitation. He finally understood. At that moment, it was crystal clear, 100% solid. He wasn't going to trust in his own strength. He was going to trust in the strength of God. And he went straight back to that camp, and he told them, he said, we're going to do this right now. He divided those 300 men into 3 companies. There were 100 each. And he wanted to spread them out around the hill just above the Midianite camp. He said, at just the right moment, follow my lead, at just the right moment, we're going to blow these trumpets. We're going to break these clay pots. We're going to show them our torches. And then we're going to shout out that this is for the Lord and for Gideon. And in the Midianite camp, the Bible says it was about the time the guards had changed their watch, probably around midnight. And they hear the noise of all these pots being broken and these trumpets being blown. And they assumed they were being attacked. And most likely, it was at that point, I think about those camels that were so numerous you couldn't even count them. They hearing all those pots broken too. And all those horns blowing. I can imagine camels running through the camp with people. And as the Midianites came out of their tents, they see all these men running around the camp. It's dark. And they just assume that the men they see are the men from Gideon's army. They've just been brought out of a deep sleep. And that would be their first assumption. This must be Gideon's army. So in fear, they start attacking and killing each other. Now, while all that's going on, Gideon and his men are just standing up on the hill watching. They're not really doing anything. God had turned the Midianites against each other. Now, it would be tempting to think, somebody might say, well, I guess this is a great example of how we ought to just sit back and watch God work. But I don't think that's the lesson here. I think God wants us to trust Him, but He wants to work through us. He wants us to be available. And in this case, for the victory to be complete, the Israelites had to completely destroy the Midianites. So they chased them down. They finally brought the heads of 2 of the leaders, Oreb and Zeb, the Gideon, who at that point, it says in the last verse we read, that he was at the Jordan River. And it's also important to notice again that he called the tribe of Ephraim for help. He hadn't called them in the beginning because they were the southernmost tribe that was involved. And next week, when we get to the next chapter, we're going to see that they weren't very happy that they weren't called in the first place. But there's still some great lessons here that we can learn. And I think one of the first one is, you don't need an army when the Lord's on your side. And this is a lesson that we keep forgetting every single day. Whatever you're going through in your life, we're always trying to come up with enough courage to face it. We're always trying to come up with the right plan to deal with it. And this might be a shock to you, but I want you to understand something. God does not need your help. He involves us so we can share in His glory. But He doesn't need us like we need Him. Think about it this way. If you're a parent and you're going to do something and you invite one of your kids to come help you do it, you don't really need that kid to do anything. That kid can just sit there and watch TV. But you say, hey, come help me with this. Now, it's probably going to take you longer to do it now because you invited a kid to do it. And you're going to have to explain to them every little thing that you're doing. But why did you invite them in the first place? Well, you wanted them to learn something. And you also wanted to spend some time with them. And that's what we need to learn. We need to learn that God calls us to help Him, not because He needs us, but He wants us to spend time with Him. And He wants to give us opportunities to learn. And one of the things you can learn, and what Gideon certainly learned, is that God is sufficient. Later on, Paul would say, God's easily going to supply all of your needs. All of your needs are coming from His riches and glory. You don't have to worry about what you're going to eat tomorrow. You don't have to worry about what you're going to wear tomorrow. All those things are going to be taken care of. God's going to supply all of your needs. You know, Gideon felt too small for the job that he was called to do because, quite frankly, he was too small for the job he was called to do. But you notice when he was walking with the Lord, he couldn't be defeated. Not even by an army that outnumbered them 450 to 1. We're always trying to fix things. We're trying to fix things. We come up with new programs. We try to fix people's personalities. We try to change our arguments and things. We try to change our plans because we want to fix something. But you know what? Until we turn to the Lord and trust Him, just like the Israelites, we have to come up against the Midianites that we face every day, and we'll never overcome them until we trust the Lord, just like the Israelites did. Everybody here has a Midian out there. You may feel like you have some sort of physical limitation. Somebody at work may be getting on your last nerve. You may have a spouse that's just disinterested in everything. You may have some big financial challenge hanging over your head right now. You may have some big legal problem that you're afraid to deal with. Whatever that Midian is, whatever that problem you're facing is, the answers are the same as it was for the Israelites. You need to stop trying to do everything on your own and trust the Lord. God's not interested in making our lives pleasant. He wants more for us. He wants to teach us how to go through every situation we're facing in a way that ultimately trusts Him and gives Him the glory. And one of the biggest challenges we face, and I think as Americans especially, is that we have to stop trying to fix everything in our own strength. We'd be much better served to set aside the worry that we have and spend that time in prayer. If you're worried, stop worrying and start praying. It doesn't mean that you're not going to continue to worry. I'm just saying, try to replace the practice of worry with something like prayer. And let God speak to you. But I think the second thing we learn here is that some of the impossible challenges are the places where we learn the most and experience some of our greatest victories. If you've been a believer for any length of time, think about the times when you felt closest to God. And for a lot of us, it's going to be when we saw God working, when we were going through something that was so horrible we didn't think we'd ever get through. And at that moment, when we were terrified, we were just scared out of our minds, what's going to happen? We felt like we were in an impossible spot. And in the middle of that, God gave us peace, and He gave us strength to do whatever it was that we had to do. That there's never been a point where it didn't end that way for believers. We look back, we had some tough times. We may be going through some tough times individually, who knows? But sometimes I believe that God has to let our legs be knocked out from under us before we'll turn to Him. Because again, there are too many people out there saying, well, I don't need God's help right now because I can help myself. Well, this is like your parent letting you help with that project. You're not really doing the work. The parent is doing everything. God can survive just fine without us. We'll waste away if we don't have Him. And this is where some people get really confused about the Christian faith. And we've talked about this before. They think that the Christian faith is somebody talking to me about a list of rules that I now have to follow. And all God wants to do, some people will say, is control you. So He's giving you all these rules so that you're being controlled. You're like a puppet on a string. But God didn't give us the laws and commandments to control us. He gave us those laws and commandments to show us how to live. Did you ever have a do-it-yourself project that came with instructions? Something you had to put together? Hopefully you read the instructions first, but not if you're like me. And if you're like me, a lot of times when you're finished, you feel like you're smarter than the people that designed it, because I didn't need all the parts they had in there to begin with. But it doesn't last as long as it would if I read the book. And it's the same thing with God's laws. They're not there like a whip to keep you in line. They're given to show you a way that things are supposed to fit together. It's like those instructions. If you put those things together in the way that God tells you to, they'll be put together properly. The message of the gospel is actually what makes us alive. It's not what tears us down. And God leads us to where we really want to be and ultimately where we really need to be. You know, we can resist doing that, but it's to our own disadvantage if we do that. God showed grace and mercy to Israel, and they kept spitting in His face with their idolatry, but when they cried out to God, He was still there to deliver them. God knew from the very beginning of time that we needed a deliverer. And He gave us that deliverer in Jesus Christ. We talk about how we need to find the Lord. Somebody said, I finally found the Lord. He wasn't hiding. In fact, He was looking for you. You might be going through a tough time. Ask yourself, is it possible that God's using whatever you're going through right now to get your attention? Maybe instead of running away from God, you need to run toward God. God wants you to understand He loves you. He wants to give you forgiveness. He wants to give you grace. He wants to give you a new beginning. Gideon learned that the Lord could do far more than he ever imagined God could do. I would have been scared to death. I mean, every time I read this story, it always makes me think about people that go into combat, people that go into battle. I can't imagine the fear that goes with that. And especially if you knew the odds were 450 to 1 against you. But how would it feel if you walked into that situation and you just stood there and they ran around killing each other? That's what happened with Gideon. Gideon learned God was going to get the victory in the end. If somebody said, well, Gideon, you fought pretty hard, he could say, yeah, I stood there pretty good. I stood there on that hill. I held a torch. That's what I did. I blew a horn. That's what I did. He'd have to give God the victory. God could do far more than Gideon imagined. You might think it's impossible for God to get you through your situation. In fact, you might think it's impossible for God to change somebody like you. But God is the God of miracles. And the next miracle might be the miracle He does in your heart. It's time for you to trust God more than you trust your own understanding. We want to give you an opportunity right now to turn your life over. To say, you know what? I want God to be the driving force in my life, the controlling force in my life. The decisions that I make today and from this day forward, I want them to be done in a way that ultimately is going to bring glory to God. If you want to do that, why not do it right now? If you've never received Christ as your Savior, do that right now. There are all kinds of decisions God will lead us to make. You know what they are. God's speaking to your heart. Don't leave here without making it. Let's stand together as we sing.